Well, it looks like we're now live. I'm Greg Salmieri. This is Ben Bayer. Over here we have some other friends, and we are all here in Atlanta, where we are attending the Ayn Rand Con, which is a conference on Ayn Rand philosophy, mostly a students' conference. And since we're here in the same place, and we have some other readers of Atlas Shrugged here. Oh, Jen, you're out of frame. I don't know how to deal with that. Let's see.
No, I can move. There you go.
Jen and
Make it all about me.
yeah, make it all about Jen. Since we have some other readers of Atlas Shrugged here, people who are participating in the project, we thought we'd give it a shot, going live in suboptimal conditions, and see if we could chat a little bit about Atlas Shrugged. Jen, you're still not quite in the frame. Yeah, look at that. Go sit on the table.
Look at all this.
Indeed. So we don't really have anything in particular in mind to talk about. We just thought we'd take the occasion to be together. We're up to part 1, chapter 9 still. Moving on to chapter 10. I guess on the discussion forum we're already up to chapter 10, and Ben and I are going to discuss that with you all from New York. Am I allowed to say you all, because I'm not a Southerner? With all of you from New York on Tuesday. Ben's an honorary Southerner for those in New Orleans.
That'll get people upset.
It gets you upset?
Not me, no.
Who does it get upset? Is anyone?
Other Southerners, but you don't have to talk about that.
All right, so let's talk about Atlas Shrugged. Does anyone have any topics they want to talk about that are spoiler-free? So you're putting everybody on the spot.
I think it would be interesting to talk about that. We just had a conference, Ayn Rand Institute just had a conference about what it means to be for liberty.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of discussion of political philosophy. And when you hear Atlas Shrugged talked about in popular media and discourse, it's almost synonymous with the idea of laissez-faire capitalism and a certain political viewpoint. And interestingly, we're almost done with a third of the book, and we barely talked about politics at all for the whole session. Is there a way now maybe to reflect a little bit more about Ayn Rand's view of liberty and Ayn Rand's view of capitalism as embodied in the first third of the book, at least, without giving too many spoilers?
It looked like we got knocked off and we're back online. Well, any thoughts about that? Any thoughts on the political content of the first third of the novel, or the almost third? Yeah, Mohammed.
Yeah, there are no sympathetic characters, as far as we can tell, who's sympathetic and who's not, that have any government roles insofar, again, as we've seen people in government. So we've seen Leslie Mauch. It seems to be people that are generally not put in the best light, that seem to take part in the political activities of the day. There's talk of these deals that Hank Reardon doesn't like. So it seems that there are a lot of unscrupulous characters in the government, but that's all we sort of get.
Yeah, in a way that in the best person, if people are not here, we're all going to have to talk up because we're getting the cameras recordings of you, but
Oh, you have that, okay.
yeah, I'm not, and I was watching the monitor. I think we should get some audio from everyone, but I don't. So the only people online, if anyone's watching this, tell us if you could hear us.
One person says the sound is echoey, but that's all so far.
We're in well, it might be echoed because we have multiple mics on these different cameras that aren't synced well. This is, as we say, an experiment, so it's a commando episode of it.
We're all commando here.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I realize.
But to Mohammed's point,
Yeah, I mean, the maybe closest to a sympathetic character we found in government so far is Dr. Stadler, and his having this position as the head of a government research institute is I think, indicated a bad thing about him, or it's at least suggested by characters who are sympathetic.
we forgot one.
Well, who's that?
Judge Narragansett.
Oh, that's true. We've met Judge. We haven't met Judge Narragansett, but he's been referred to, or is referred to in. I think it's first chapter 10 actually, but I guess chapter 10 is fair game already. I'm trying to adjust this.
Actually, I think it's chapter 10 when Dagny is interviewing the various people who are trying to give her a lead to finding who the inventor of the motor was. And was it Lee Hunsaker or?
Yeah, Lee
That she
Hunsaker.
interviews, and he's one of the ones who was trying to run the 20th Century Motor Company and needed to get a loan, and they passed a law saying that Midas Mulligan's Bank had to give him a loan, but Judge Narragansett struck the law down. But then it was overturned by a higher court.
Right.
And so there's a clear case of a government official who's pretty sympathetic, at least insofar as he's being paired off against an unsympathetic character who's Lee Hunsaker. And we had at this conference talked a fair amount about the role of the courts and the judicial system in protecting and defending liberty, and more generally, the importance of government. And so, here one maybe additional point about popular view of Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged is sometimes people associate with her view an anti-government position. And one of the things that we talked about a lot at this conference is that's not the case. And maybe you should say more about that.
We'll be more in a position to see this in Atlas Shrugged in a few weeks. There's a famous speech that's given in part 2, in chapter 2 of part 2, where one of the characters says, you'll know your society is doomed, you're going downhill, something's wrong, when the laws protect this kind of person instead of that kind of person. When the government has become this instead of that. The idea is in a proper society, at least according to this character who will remain, I won't say which one it is, it's someone we already met, but for a couple of chapters, his view at least is there is an important function for government. But so far the people we've seen in government, except for Judge Narragansett, who's left, right, when his decision got overturned, have seemed to be a pretty crummy lot. There's other political content in the novel that we've seen so far. I think it illustrates some points. One thing is you mentioned Lee Hunsaker. I guess we're already in chapter 10, so we can talk about him.
Just a few days.
He's a kind of amusing parody of Marxism, right? So this is this guy who sued because he could never sued under some law that was meant for day laborers because nobody ever gave him a chance, and therefore he should be able to own a factory. But now he's a kind of congenital screw-up. And he's...
They didn't give enough time for the tools to...
Right, exactly. So he's always worried about that Marx says that the tools of production condition your mind, or condition you. And he's upset that he doesn't have the right tools of production. His typewriter doesn't work.
Always skips spaces.
That's what...
It makes me wonder if Ayn Rand's typewriter actually did skip spaces and she's making the point that...
Well, we have the manuscript, so we should love the typescript. But she might have upgraded by the time of Atlas Shrugged. Maybe We the Living was typed on a less good typewriter and cheaper. So we have Lee Hunsaker, who I think is a kind of parody of Marxism. It's meant to be a funny character, I think.
His last name's Hunsaker. Very subtle.
You mean like he fires Huns?
No,
like the Hun sacking Rome.
Hunsaker. They stole,
Like Rome and
wealth.
Connection. Yeah.
I think my sense is she just thought it was a kind of, I don't know, maybe. But
I had the same thought.
her villains often have these kind of like Claude Slagenhop, and these kind of long names that sound goofy. But I mean, also the more serious kind of Marxist element we saw is Ivy Starnes, right, also in chapter 10, who implements from each according to his ability to each according to his need, and needs rather, at the 20th Century Motor Company with what seemed to have been ill results, and we'll learn more about those results later. But I think, the kinds of things relevant to the themes of liberty we've been talking about at this conference, and the themes of that the mind requires freedom to function, that we live by means of our mind, that the reason is the faculty by which human beings live, that reason is a creative faculty, and that it needs freedom to function. I think we see a lot of that in the characterization of Reardon, and in how Reardon is thwarted by various laws that are passed. So Reardon Metal is such a successful company because Reardon is engaged in this kind of vertical integration, because whenever Reardon sees that one of his supplies that he needs for his either making steel or making Reardon metal is not reliable, he then goes out and buys or creates or goes into the business of manufacturing that. So Reardon mines limestone or etc., all of which is needed for his steel making, and that's why Reardon Steel is the only reliable steel maker. And since Reardon metal requires a lot of copper, and he sees that the copper supply is becoming unreliable, he tries to buy a copper mine, and he does, contract for a property where he's going to mine copper. But then this new equalization of opportunity bill stops him from being able to do that. And if you look at the scene where Reardon reflects on the effects of this on him, it's like people are slashing off parts of his body. These things that he kind of thinks about, figures out what to do with, integrates into a business are part of his life. And they're part of his life because his mind has has recognized how to integrate them into a self-sustaining whole, and then he's gone out and made them his property. And that's being denied, and two effects of that. One is he feels like parts of his life are being slashed away. But also, he, for the first time, he's somebody who always knows how to think about what to do. But he's finding he can't. There's no thought possible to him in this situation. There's no action is possible to him. And
could you say more about that? Because one of the topics that I think there was originally going to be a talk on at this conference, but for various reasons got rescheduled, was force versus the mind, and how force stops thinking. And I think the scene that you're talking about is one where we get a real kind of concrete illustration of this fairly abstract concept of Ayn Rand's, and has a lot to do with why she thinks we need to have liberty and property rights, and that they go together. Could you say more about the significance of that scene and the broader point in her philosophy?
Well, she says somewhere, she says that force paralyzes and negates the mind. And there are two things it does. It negates your thinking in the sense that if you've worked out what to do, but now I've put you in a situation where you're under my coercion, you then can't do that thing. So what's the point if you're having thought it through? So in that sense, it negates your thinking. So Reardon figured out that the right thing to do was to get this copper mine. That was going to help his business go forward. And all that thought is now negated. There was no point to it, given that suddenly a new law passed, and he can't operate a copper mine. But then it paralyzes in the sense of, real thinking isn't just trying to solve some academic problem that's disconnected from life and reality, that's set up with kind of like a problem in a textbook where all the constraints are laid out and you just have to think it through. Rather, real serious thinking amounts to checking premises, thinking of new ways to think of things, thinking about how what you're trying to figure out relates to all of the rest of your life. It's a kind of integrative process that requires thinking about how it will tie to your action, particularly when it's problem-solving, thinking that's related to what you're going to do. It's not just how do you solve this problem with all these parameters preset, but what parameters can you change? How can you affect things? And when there are a lot of constraints that are put on by someone else's force, that even if you think it should be this way, we should do it this way, but we can't because people won't allow us, that means that those areas are not areas that it's open to you to think in. So if the laws are such that Reardon can't operate multiple businesses, then he can't really think about how it would be best if he were operating multiple businesses or how he would go about doing it. Because there's not an answer to that question. There's no kind of realm for planning there. And so in that sense, his thought is paralyzed about how to proceed with it.
And if he kind of pretended to think about it, the words went through his mind, it would be detached from the evidence that's actually available to him. It would be basically what Ayn Rand calls arbitrary, engaging in the arbitrary fantasy kind of thing.
Yeah,
I mean, it earlier illustrated a little bit in Atlas as well with regard to the statement by the State Science Institute about his metal, where maybe the break under pressure, and maybe
that's the kind of clear case of the arbitrary. I think there are cases where you can do what if kind of thinking that isn't arbitrary, it's kind of healthy fantasizing. And Reardon could do that. How would I run a business in this other kind of society that we don't have? But then that's not thinking about how to improve his business, which is what he was trying to do. And now that's not open to him to think about. So that's another area where we see some of the things we've been talking about in this conference, how we're doing equalization of opportunity. Yeah, Victoria.
A question. The bill that was passed, isn't that also similar to the antitrust laws that we have today?
Yeah, it's, I think, exactly like the antitrust laws.
That's what I thought when I read this part of the book. I was like, this this is the antitrust laws, and a lot of businesses are being penalized, for lack of better words, for trying to be innovative or trying to streamline their production process instead of having to depend on other people to supply them the raw materials they need. They're trying to produce it themselves, but then you have, or they try to buy companies that produce it at a fair price, and you have other people saying, oh no, if these two companies merge, they're going to be too big, and it's antitrust. We have to stop these companies from merging, or how Microsoft was forced to diversify its business pursuits and break off some parts of its company because people thought they were too big.
It's a little bit different from the antitrust laws just in the following respect, which in some ways makes it worse and in some ways better. In Atlas Shrugged, with equalization of opportunity, though, nobody is allowed to own more than two businesses. So the antitrust, or more than one business, sorry. So the antitrust laws that we have now don't forbid that. Plenty of people own more than one business. The way the antitrust laws work is that certain businesses are seen as monopolies because they have more than a certain amount of the market share, and then they're not allowed to engage in certain wide classes of activities that are not very well defined, that are described as anti-competitive. So that, in a way, you might think is less bad than the law on Atlas Shrugged, because it's not victimizing every business person who seeks to integrate by having multiple businesses. But from Rand's perspective, there's a respect in which the antitrust laws are even worse, which is that they're singling out for persecution the very best, the most successful, the most creative, the most innovative, and therefore the businesses that have created whole new fields of endeavor and captured large market shares. And she wrote quite a bit on antitrust. She thought one of the biggest problems in the country, one of the ones that's most important to address. And her main first big essay is called America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business, which is a really fantastic essay.
Should we talk at all about the bill that's passed at the end of Chapter 10, which we haven't really talked about yet, but we're going to talk about on Tuesday?
Well, say what you like.
Well, okay, so what does it do? It limits the number of cars and the number of trains that can run in and out of Colorado. It says that the Tiger Transcontinental has to provide equal amount of service, not just to Colorado, but to surrounding states. It says the Bearden has to give an equal amount of metals to the people who ask for it, not just the customers that he prefers to sell it to. It puts a moratorium on the payment of bonds, which Dagny had sold in order to fund the running of the John Galt line. Are there any analogs to political situation today that you might want to talk about in connection with any?
I mean, one that comes to mind is what people are trying to do to Google and YouTube. Mm-hmm. So the idea that there are a lot of right-wing groups that are upset about YouTube, which is owned by Google, demonetizing certain videos by right-wing, or people who are perceived as right-wing, including Dave Rubin, some of his videos, who spoke at this conference and who I can be started talking to. But they demonetize them, which means, in some cases they've actually taken people's videos and things offline, I think, at least temporarily. But the bigger thing is they won't run ads on your videos. They think, for some people, they don't run ads on their videos or certain videos, and there's a widespread perception, which might be true, among a certain segment of the right, that they're doing this differentially to right-wing personalities as a means of spreading their own ideology at least, and not spreading right-wing ideology, or not letting it be spread. And so there's, I think, a lawsuit now by Dennis Prager of Prager University, yes, trying to compel YouTube to treat all videos alike on the grounds that YouTube is basically a public utility, or the equivalent of one.
Well, I've heard different accounts of this, because it may be that they're also making a point about the contractual nature of the relationship that PragerU got into when they posted videos, and as we know from the legal panel, you'd have to have more legal knowledge to be able to diagnose.
Yeah, I think there have been two arguments made. So one is a kind of contractual argument that it seems to be part of the Prager case. But the other is a broader point that is, I think, also being made as part of the Prager case, but is being made then by a lot of other people, apart from it that YouTube is censoring and YouTube is mistreating these people, because YouTube is such an essential service that for them to not have your video on it amounts to for them to censor your video, for them to forbid people from viewing it, for them to materially harm you. What YouTube has created and provided is such a great value that therefore they're not allowed to discriminate who gets that value or not. And I think that's similar to Taggart Transcontinental now providing this kind of transportation.
Well, you don't have to restrict our focus to the people on the right who are making this kind of urging this kind of policy, because you see it in even grander scale, generally coming from the left, with regard to the whole concept of net neutrality.
Yes, that's a really good point.
And there's a real analog there between what they want to do to Taggart Transcontinental. This is the information superhighway. They're trying to do to the virtual means of communication as they did to and they really did this to the railroads in the 19th century, basically. And I mean, the result was Amtrak. So the people who want, in other words, it destroyed the private railroads, right? To the point where if you wanted to get past passenger rail service, there had to be a government subsidy. And now they're trying to do the same thing to the internet service providers, saying you have to give equal amounts of bandwidth to any old website that wants to come along, even if some websites want to pay you more for it. And it's kind of a personal thing for us, right? Because I mean, half of the technical issues that we've dealt with in trying to put up this broadcast have dealt with the fact that we can't get the broadband that we want, even if we pay for it. And it's because it's entirely because of the net neutrality.
Well, the net neutrality laws there aren't net neutrality laws in force now that are what's stopping us from getting.
I think there are. I think that it's a default FCC ruling that has not really been overturned, even under the Trump administration. So I could be wrong about that.
I mean, as a matter of just, so our issue has been that broadband, there's not really good broadband signal in New Orleans, or that's one of our issues. And I don't know there are a lot of bad laws in this. They've been mostly advocated by the left, I think by some libertarian groups too, and by, a lot of...
we're having trouble getting good connection here too, though.
Yeah, we're having a little connection here, but here we're not, we just plug in a computer to a phone and we're seeing what happens. I don't know if I don't know if in a better, if certain recent laws were changed, if New Orleans' signal would be better than it is or not. But I think the point is quite right, more generally, that it's important that there be the means for companies, the way that we get infrastructure, especially higher infrastructure with greater bandwidth, that can only be justified by certain specialized business needs that are new, right? Is that the people who have those needs then pay for it. And then they get the greater bandwidth, and then we can have those products, and often then that then trickles down to other people. But even if it doesn't become the case that everybody now is using this greater bandwidth for other things, it makes possible these new products and services which couldn't be had otherwise. And yeah, I think net neutrality is, I seized on the YouTube one because you said recently, and that's in the news these days, but net neutrality has been a really big issue for decades now.
And there were real steps taken toward what they want out of that concept under the Obama administration.
Yes.
And I don't think it's been fully changed. So that's anything else about the bill passed at the end of the chapter.
It's not a bill, it's a set of regulations
you made this correction
that
before.
were
That's
made possible by the legislature giving now
emergency powers.
Emergency powers.
Well, okay, so there's a connection. There's an issue that's come up somewhat at this conference, or at least in conversations that we've had on the side about the rule of law and the role of non-objective law and undermining the rule of law. Sometimes this non-objective law comes in the form of the executive powers. I had a conversation last night with one of our lawyer friends about the administrative agencies and the administrative state, which has been granted all of this power just by default of the legislature, that doesn't want to define various legal concepts, and so leaves it to the administrative state to do the defining themselves. It's
you said with like Yes Minister, yeah.
Just like that British comedy show Yes Minister, which is an unelected body that is nominally part of the executive branch of the government, but the executive branch, because is because the executive branch is elected and these administrative agencies are unelected, they keep their jobs regardless of the transition of the administration.
And it's not,
they're
and
de
it's
facto
not
running
even
much of the
better if they don't keep their jobs, because if they're changed, then sometimes they should be changed. But the problem is there are people who are empowered to change policy kind of summarily, right, on whim, because they decided now that it should be this rather than that. And it's hard to know if it's better to have one entrenched group doing it, or to have it shift with each election, and then the policies change radically, and nobody could have any, nobody can know what things are going to be like 4 years from now. And of course, some people's policies are worse than others, and so it's better than, I think, there's something good about the change up when you're getting better policies on it, and certainly in many of the regulatory agencies, I think the current policies are better than the policies under the previous administration. I'm not sure in all, but the real problem here is that there's all this power in the hands of people who can just change it.
And it's not objectively codified. It's left to the arbitrary whims of bureaucrats and administrative courts whose powers are unspecified, and where the parties who are subject to the laws really have no way of knowing in advance whether they're breaking the law or whether they're abiding by the letter of the law, because it's inaccessible and the standards are not clear. And we've talked about Ayn Rand's concept of objective law, which is not just the idea that law ought to be based on objective purposes of government, not just for the sake of protecting individual rights, but also needs to be clearly articulated and defined in advance so that people know whether or not they're doing it.
The law needs to be objectively justified on the basis of individual rights, and objective in itself, that is objectively specified so that you know what is illegal and what isn't, and what are the procedures and what are the punishments. And there are really two big issues here with these regulatory agencies. One is that often the laws are vague and the powers they have are vague, and you can't tell what you'll be prosecuted for and what you won't. And this is a big issue with antitrust and with one of Rand's main complaints about it. Another is you don't know how it's going to change and when it's going to change. And so if you're trying to do planning for business in the long range, right, a lot of what you have to do is have Washington men and have your lobbyists fight with other lobbyists and so forth. And more of business becomes about that rather than becoming about discovering new products, doing market validation and so forth. And you get a more Jim Taggart approach to business flowering rather than a Daphne Taggart or Hank Rearden.
Well, I was just going to say about Daphne, back to chapter 10, there's a lot in this chapter, which we're about to discuss on Tuesday, about how she herself is paralyzed in the attempt to run her business because she doesn't know what it is that these regulators want. She doesn't know when she's breaking the law, and so she kind of gives up trying to fight. She says, "I'll leave that to Jim Taggart. He'll take care of it somehow. I'm not sure what." Instead, she spends more time pursuing the inventor of this motor, which is something we'll talk more about.
But business becomes, in this context, more and more about politics, right? More and more about politicking, about lobbying, about trying to get the laws which there's no version of them that's really fair or neutral. So trying to get them to favor you rather than the other guy, rather than favoring the other guy rather than you. And when we're in a situation where the laws are passed in the public interest, as these are, and there are people who are empowered to do whatever they think is in the public interest, the issue is then you've got to fight for the title of I'm the public, and my customers are the public, whereas her customers aren't the public, therefore they should, the law should favor my business to her. And we see just a lot of this, and we've started to see this in Atlas Shrugged already. I think we see a lot more of this in parts 2 and 3.
And this issue that you just raised about the vague concept of the public interest and how different parties compete over, being representatives of that concept, also reminds me of something that's come up at this conference to some extent, which is the question of what's the difference between a society that's governed by liberty and an anarchic society. And you made some very interesting points, I think, about this similarity between anarchy and various forms of statist collectivism, which is a point that's very distinctive to Ayn Rand's thinking that a lot of people find bizarre. That it's like, what do you mean anarchy is the same as communist dictatorship? But do you want to elaborate maybe a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's put aside the full communist dictatorship for a moment and think about the workings of a mixed economy. And this is something Rand discusses in a number of articles on the wreckage of the consensus and the new fascism rule by consensus, both of which are published in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, I think, and you can find them elsewhere too. That they were originally in her periodicals, and they got anthologized to these books. There's the idea that the way a government works in a mixed economy is you have different factions kind of competing for who can seize control of the various levers of power for the time being and get the measures that help their crew over the measures of the other group. I mean, you get this in electoral politics, you get this in with lobbying, and you get all the kind of stuff. I mean, Al-Qardawi was discussing public choice theory a fair amount from that, and you get all the kinds of stuff that public choice theory tells you about. And public choice theory talks about the various incentives on different members of the political process, on voters, but also on legislators and lobbyists and so forth, that tend to lead to ever-growing arbitrary powers in the hands of government, because each person, each faction, when they can get into authority, wants to consolidate power. And Rand discusses this quite a bit in the New Fascism article. Now, what's happening in that kind of situation is you have the equivalent of gang warfare. Gangs ganging up on the street, fighting each other. The more people you have, the greater your numbers. There's a kind of might makes right. I have the greatest constituency, so I can get this bill through, or I can get this regulation altered to help this industry rather than that industry. Rather than what? Rather than thinking in principle about what the right way to organize a society is that protects individual rights for everyone. And when the government has powers, that is, when we decide that government should by force deal with things, other than protecting people's rights, keeping it so that everybody is free to act on their own judgment within their own sphere, but when rather what it's doing is trying to manage the economy, then, and it's trying to manage the economy for the public good, then it's just gangs jostling for who gets to be called the public. And it's the same as kind of regular gang warfare, except that it's in suits and ties through the legislative process, which makes it less violent and better in some respects, but doesn't change the essential nature of it.
But also somewhat more maddening because it's pretending to be legitimate.
Yeah. So it muddies the waters in a sense. So other thoughts, stuff you guys want to talk about here? It could be about the political issues in Atlas Shrugged or other issues in Atlas Shrugged, so long as it does not include spoilers. The Atlas project is up to, well, we've had our session on book 1, part 1, chapter 9, and we're doing the one on chapter 10 on Tuesday, so I guess it's fair game to discuss.
And if you're watching online, there are a few of you watching online, I am trying to monitor your comments, and so if you have anything you want to say, feel free, and we might be able to address it, though because of net neutrality, I'm having trouble.
It looks like we have 31 viewers.
Yeah.
Are you?
Pretty good for an unannounced broadcast, I think.
Yeah. Hi, all 31 of you. Ben, if you hand me my bag over there, I can pull up the app Pooja and Michael made for us.
I brought it up myself. I have been watching it.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Hold on, let me put the camera down. You speak loudly.
Coming full circle with the comments of Mohammed, the comment you made about that there are no government officials who are depicted in the positive light. I never got that. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that the context of nature of the government that we're talking about, this sort of dystopia, what kind of people would be willing to serve in a government like that? And I think it's a really complicated issue. Even today, if you're seeking a job which falls under a proper function of government, and yet it's enforcing various laws which violate your understanding of individual rights, let's say a police officer today who's got to enforce drug laws that you find unconscionable or something like that. I think that's, if you could speak to that, like even, so one is I never felt it was Rand attacking government officials qua government officials. It's who would, and at what point do you draw the line? Like when the government has become totalitarian, are you going to serve in a government like that? And I don't think we're there yet in Atlas Shrugged. But if you could speak to that point, and then also even today, let's say you're willing, if, I don't know if this still is irrelevant for this discussion, but if you want to work, let's say you're a soldier and the government's sending you in a war that you find unjustified, where, in your opinion, where do you draw the line? How do you deal with a situation like that?
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about some of the stuff about the state of the society in Atlas Shrugged we learn more about later than where we are in the book, but we can certainly see that it's a society that's very corrupt, and I think that's going to influence whether somebody wants to be a part of that government, right? And we've already seen now, in the case of Judge Narragansett, a ruling that he must think is the just ruling. He made it, gets overturned, and shortly after that he quits. And we don't know for sure why he quit, why he retires. But Dagny, when she hears that he did, thinks, could it have been because of this? Could it have been because of this? And we see this with other people in the society, not just in the government, like Midas Mulligan. We learn retires after he's made to comply with this this bad ruling rather than comply with it. And Dagny's thinking, is that why he left? Or surely he must have had to put up with other horrible things. This couldn't have broken him. So there's a question as to both participating in government and participating in other aspects of the society. When you think there's something wrong in your society, when you should do it, and how. I don't think we can say too much about that in Atlas at this point, because we learn more about what's going on and the various decisions people are making as we go forward. But with regard to our current society and our current government, there are issues of you might be made to enforce an unjust law if you're a police officer, right? Like the drug laws. You might be, if you're a soldier, ordered to prosecute what you think of as an unjust war. But also, even putting aside that might happen, there's a lot of things you might be asked to do that are just senseless sacrifices. Maybe they're not unjust against the other people, but they're not the proper function of that job, and you're being asked to harm yourself. And Ankar and Iran both talked about this in the context of our current government. Iran said, I think it was here in his talk, it might have been on the radio, and I'm confusing when he said what, but that it's a real concern if you're going into the military now, that our military is used a lot for altruistic, self-sacrificial wars. Maybe it's not unjust of us to be in these wars, but it is unjust to our soldiers that they're being sent to fight and die under terms of engagement where they can't win and where nothing is being accomplished for America. And Ankar made the point about the police officers who died in Charlottesville, that they were given a kind of assignment that was incoherent, and they were killed because they were sent to do something dangerous that can't really.
And Ankar thought that the blame for that is on us. That we as a society have been and we've endorsed an illegitimate standard for how public property ought to be used. It ought to be open to the expression of viewpoints, and then let's say it should be any view. If you say it should be viewpoints, it should be any viewpoint. Government can't discriminate, and so we should rethink what we're asking them to try to defend, which is an impossible and incoherent.
And the point that the blame for this lies on us as citizens is goes to the point that you're making about under what conditions would you serve in the government is not limited to the government, because the government is us, as I quoted Obama saying, and then I said that's not really right, but there's something, it's not right in the way he meant it, right, because it's us, what we do by force. But nonetheless, it's we who justify, authorize this government, and if it's doing wrong things, the population has responsibility for that, and we need to be fighting against them. And the one question is what the right way to do that is, and Atlas Shrugged has ideas on that.
I mean, she herself.
I was going to go to Jen, but say what you want to know.
Rand herself thought that if you're drafted into a war that you don't agree with, or in a situation that you don't agree with, that you can't. The line that I remember, and I can't remember which essay it's in, is you don't stop the juggernaut by throwing yourself in front of it. And so, if you're really being forced to do it, there's little that you can do short of escaping from society, and not much more.
You should get martyr out of yourself.
Right. But Jen?
I just had a question, which I think that the statement "we are responsible for bad policing" makes me wonder, does that extend to all bad laws in the entire government system? We as a population are responsible for it. And if so, that rings a sort of very democratic notion. But in my experience with studying objectivism, there's a different conception or role for democracy. It's not a very democratic framework. So how would you reconcile that statement related to democracy?
Well, I mean, one issue is that I take it that his point wasn't that there ought to be unlimited majority rule, and that's how the government ought to be run. And in fact, of course, there isn't unlimited majority rule anyway, and so the kind of responsibility that he's assigning there couldn't have been on the basis of the assumption that we all got together and voted on what wars we're going to fight, right? So the way in which we're responsible is something more indirect. And we do vote for our elected officials, but broader than that, and here's a point that connects to a broader theme in the conference, right, which is that any conception of government is informed by certain basic conceptions in political philosophy, and a government can't retain power unless it is seen as legitimate by the people, whether they voted for that government or whether they were just deciding not to revolt against it. And that we have the government that we have because the majority of our society has a certain viewpoint about what a just government is. And a big point of this conference has been to challenge that conception and to underscore the importance of philosophy in informing a political viewpoint and in explaining political developments that happen over time. There are people who have views of liberty that are sometimes confused with Ayn Rand's view, that think that you can argue for a conception of liberty independently of any kind of philosophic presuppositions, independent of views about human nature and the nature of the good life. And Greg gave a very interesting talk just a couple days ago, Saturday, about how, about the very unique conception of human nature and the good life that underpins Ayn Rand's conception of liberty. And, most people don't have that view, and that's why Ayn Rand's view is a radical view. And to the extent that they accept different views, you get the kind of government that we have. And so there's that kind of responsibility. This is something to be explored in greater detail in the future chapters of Atlas Shrugged, the kind of responsibility that the general public has for various catastrophic events that happen and so forth.
Go ahead.
So I guess the next question I would have is, what about the people, such as many people who attend this conference, who are not okay with how the government has turned out? Mm-hmm. They don't like the laws, but they don't really have a lot of option within the system to do anything about it other than change the culture, which is a long-term sort of thing, and it's tough for somebody who doesn't want to make a career out of changing the culture. Are they personally responsible, sort of, because altogether in this macro scope we are responsible, then every person is individually responsible even if you really don't agree? And what type of stuff could an individual person do to deal with that responsibility today?
Well, we've got a lot of questions from people.
This was really, I forget your name, but to the question Ricardo asked about how to live in a rational society, and particularly one, I remember an essay, how to live a rational life in a rational society, but Ricardo was asking particularly a society that has censorship, and the advice that Harry Alcorn and I have was first get out if you can, and then we didn't have too much to say about what you could do besides that. So a few points. I mean, you asked about democracy, which we haven't really talked about yet, and then there's also the point about how does responsibility are each of us responsible for everything America does? So regarding democracy, democracy is a kind of a term that gets used in a lot of different ways, and it's a kind of confused term as it's used now. Sometimes it just means a society in which there's voting, and in which voting is seen as a fundamental part of the legitimacy of the people and measures voted on. And in that sense, I think voting is a good thing. And I think that is an important part of a just government, that there be voting, that the officials be voted on, that the laws ultimately be that the people who decide the laws ultimately vote on, that there's nobody in power whose power doesn't derive somehow from the consent of the populace through voting, whether directly they're voted on or they're appointed by people voted on and so forth. And so that's what we might call representative government. And that is certainly something that Ayn Rand approved of and saw as a good thing and an important political achievement and an important part of what's good about America. Democracy could also mean, however, the idea that whatever the majority wants it should get. And that the majority decides on something means that that's just and a proper way to govern. So, and that is the kind of ancient Greek view of democracy, ruled by the many, ruled by the demos, the populace. And I think there's a lot of that idea of democracy in our current way of thinking about democracy. Nobody thinks that we should have direct voting on everything. But there's a lot of, you find implicit in a lot of political thought these days, popular political thought, the premise that if this is what the majority wants, then it's okay, no matter what it is. But that doesn't follow from the idea of representative government. I mean, that it's the people who ought to have be the ones making the decisions or deciding what the laws are and who should be appointed to enforce them and to decide them and so forth, is not the same thing as saying whatever the people choose is okay. And to say that we should have representative government means that not just that each of us is empowered to have a say in the law, but also that each of us has a responsibility to choose laws justly, to choose elected officials justly, to do it based on the proper principles of government, not just anything you say goes. And just the fact that the majority of people want to, say in the American South, want to have Jim Crow laws, or in Germany have, a Holocaust, if that was what, or have Hitler anyway, does not mean that that's okay. In that case, the majority is bad, and what the majority wants is bad. And empowering people by giving them the vote, us empowering everyone in society by giving them the vote, also places a responsibility on everyone. If everybody is now an agent, somebody who has the moral responsibility to make wise, thoughtful choices with regard to the government. And that means has a responsibility to understand the principle of individual rights, to think about what it means to apply it, and not just whatever, that you have the vote doesn't mean it's acceptable, moral, for you to vote to screw some businessman because you want his product, or whatever it might be. Now, what kind of responsibility do we each have as individuals? Well, I think if you're doing everything you can, or everything that, if you're making it clear that you don't support the bad laws, what you regard as bad laws, you're thoughtful about them, you're no part of the movement that's advocating for them, and you are spending some time and effort consistent with, your hierarchy of values, and knowing that your whole life isn't about politics, fighting them, then I think there's a serious and real sense in which you're not responsible for the fact that other people in your society have enacted laws that you regard as unjust. But you are still deciding to continue to live in and associate with the society, and that fact has consequences. And so, for example, if your society is prosecuting an unjust war against some other society, even if you're doing everything you can within your power within your society to fight against that happening, you're a legitimate target of the weapons from the other people, because you're a member of this society that's acting as a whole on the other society. And so I don't think there's a sense in which, as members of the society, we're responsible for what happens, another sense in which we're not, if we are not part of the problem.
And I get the sense from this conference that many of the students in attendance here are doing exactly the kinds of things that you think I think you would agree they ought to be doing to try to, critically examine the nature of the society and work to change it.
Yeah, and the first thing is thinking about it, right? So calls, I'm skeptical of people who want, particularly with young people, to issue great calls for action. You get on the barricades and do this. The first thing that's always required is think about it. Try to figure out what's true here. Don't try to get, sign people up for your army. And one thing that I think becomes apparent in Atlas is that spoilers.
I know what you're saying.
It often takes a long time to understand that and to get to the bottom, particularly if you've been taught certain false premises, coming to understand and rethink things takes time.
And this has been a common theme at this conference, between the conference and I think what we're doing with the Atlas Project, which is that both of them are really open to people who have many different levels of interest in Ayn Rand. And we have people in both the conference and in the project who are longtime fans of Rand and who are in agreement with her philosophy. But I get the sense, especially at this conference, and I looked at the statistics for it, that the majority of the people here are not any kind of self-described objectivists. They're people who are interested in it, maybe inspired by it, but the majority of the people are just curious about it and looking to explore it more. And I think much the same is true of a lot of the people who are participating in the online version of the Atlas Project, and that's great.
Yeah, and I think I agree, and that's important. It shouldn't be we all as people participating in these discussions should be aware that this novel and Rand in general raises complex, difficult, challenging issues that take a long time to think through, that people are going to reach different opinions on, that a lot of people are going to find some value in it but disagree with a lot of it and so forth. And that's just the nature of philosophy, and the nature of political theory, as far as we're dealing more at this conference about the political side of the philosophy. That's in the nature of these kinds of things, and you shouldn't expect quick and easy agreement, and you should, I'm not saying whatever positions anybody reaches on things are okay. I've already said if you end up voting for certain things, I think you're in the wrong and not doing what you have a moral responsibility to do. But what those moral responsibilities aren't always obvious. It takes time to think them through, and one has to be patient with oneself and with others, and recognize that a lot of disagreement along the way is a part of the process. Other topics people want to talk about? I don't know how long we've gone.
We've gone about 51 minutes.
Other topics pertaining to Atlas Shrugged don't have to be pertaining to politics people want to talk about.
Probably.
We've got this guy in the back, yeah. Let's see, come over here. Be by Ann there, you'll be better seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see you now.
Okay. I had a question.
Talk loudly, too.
Do you believe that democracy is the best possible or the closest possible form of government to like a fully society in which liberty is the most conducive, or do you think that there is a form of government that we are like not aware of that could potentially in some vast future could be formed, or like what are your thoughts?
Well, if I'm not aware of it, then I can't really comment much about it. I don't think there's, if by democracy you think there's a form of government democracy, then that would have to mean something like direct democracy, or that where everybody votes on everything. And I think that's a bad form of government. It's not only not the nearest of that, it's one of the worst. That's like, you execute Socrates because he pisses off too many people. And so if that's what we mean by democracy, not only do I think it's I don't think it's a good thing. If we're talking about representative government in which there's voting, the voting is on the people who enforce the laws and make the laws and so forth, I think that too is not yet a form of government, it's a feature of a government. And I think it's true that that is a necessary feature of a good government. I think it's part of what a good government has, that there is representation. But that's not the whole of the government. It's not even the whole essence of the government. It's just one important feature of the government. The essence of a proper government, I think, is that it respects individual rights and protects individual rights. And I can talk about why what I'm about to say if you like, but it follows from that there has to be representation. Then there are a lot of further questions to be asked about how to do that best. Should there be a bicameral legislature or a unicameral and all of that? And I think there are probably a lot of good ways to organize along those lines, and whether we found the best couple or, how good America is versus France and so forth, that I don't have well-worked opinions on. I imagine that there are better things in those lines than anyone's come up with yet. But those are questions of comparative detail. I have an essay on this topic, actually, the role of voting in the American political system, coming out in a book. I don't think I'm allowed to talk about what the book is yet.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking about, probably not.
Anyway, there's a book on political philosophy, a couple of them actually, on their way out. And one of them I have a piece of, several of them I have a piece of, but one of them a piece of. Mohammed, do you want to talk about that? You're just stretching. I heard a hand. Anyone else on that? Have anything they want to talk about?
I have a question on Dagny.
Yeah, speak up though, because you're far from the mic. No.
So, I just want to understand how much is it important to have an emotional connection with your work. And by that I mean, like I'm wondering if Dagny is not being supported by the president, by Jim, by the whole board. Why would she stay there? I know it's her company, it's a dad's company, but what's the emotional connection that makes her say, you know what, I want to fight for my company?
So that question went in a different direction than I thought. So, how important is it to have an emotional connection with your work? It could mean with the job that you do day in and day out, with the activities that make up your work. But I think in which case I would say, thanks, Ben pointing out that I sometimes don't switch the camera back from the question, which we've had issues a few times, but I just didn't do it, or with whoever other than this side is talking. So one question is how important is it that you have an emotional connection with the activities that are your work? And I think almost nothing could be more important. I mean, if you don't enjoy what you spend your life doing, then you're not enjoying your life. And that's just a tremendous waste and a tremendous sacrifice. But your question was about something more specific. Dagny has a connection to this particular company. And what is the nature of that connection? Should she have it? Maybe she could have some other company. At one point, she thought about leaving Tagger Transcontinental when it was going to do something that she thought was a real mistake, right? When they voted to build the San Sebastian line, and the idea seemed like a treason to her, and she wouldn't do it. I don't know how much I want to say about that because we'll get to see Dagny taking on this more and more unfold as we go through the novel. But a few things I think we could say at this point about it. I mean, one is we should be looking for how much is she enjoying her work in the sense that I was saying is super important to have, that you actually enjoy what you're doing day to day. And I think we can see that she does enjoy and love her work while she's building the John Galt line. But there are other aspects of the job she has that she doesn't get any joy out of, where it's, can she fight some regulations she doesn't know how to fight and doesn't think there is a way to fight. And then we should look, as the novel proceeds, to is she actually enjoying what she's doing? And then part of Dagny's connection to Taggart Transcontinental is this idealization she had for Nat Taggart, her ancestor, but not because he was her ancestor, but because of what he did. He created this great thing. And I think that's valid. And part of the kinds of issues she has is it's not clear any place else she goes would be any better. If in any business concern you have to deal with these bad kinds of laws and so forth, why should she not work at the one that she's loved her whole life, that has this history, that she thinks is really great? If she were to leave and let Nat Taggart's achievement be destroyed by people who she thinks are unworthy of it, what would be the point of that? She's letting a great thing that she loves be destroyed for the sake of what? Going to work somewhere else where the same thing's going to happen? She's going to have to deal with the same BS?
And it's also pretty clear that there's nowhere better in the context of this novel. I mean, this is the last great railroad, and all the others have either gone out of business or Jim Taggart has had them shut down because they're competitors.
I mean, she could have, when the Rio Norte line was, when it was decided not to build the Rio Norte line, not to rebuild the Rio Norte line, but instead to build the San Sebastian line, she could have quit Taggart Transcontinental, started her own railroad, and built a line in Colorado, like Dan Conway did.
Or gone to work for Dan Conway.
Or down to work for Dan Conway. But then, I mean, look what happened to Dan Conway. So, it's not clear that there is a better option. I think that's part of what Dagny really struggles with.
So you're saying one should fight, even if it's a small fight within a certain company, better than...
Well, I'm not saying what one should do yet. I'm saying what plight she finds herself in. It's not clear that there's some place she could go where she could have the values that she has here and not the problems.
And it's a sufficiently unique plight that she faces that it's pretty hard to generalize from what she does to what we ought to do in everyday life. And it's a double novel. It's a really unique situation in a fantastic future. That doesn't mean that certainly doesn't mean that there aren't any lessons that we can draw from it, and I take it Rand's point was that there were, but that's what those lessons are. We're not in a good position yet to talk about it, but we haven't finished the novel, and there's a lot of
We
stuff
barely
to happen.
started it. So the first third of the novel is just stage setting.
Yeah.
The novel is really about part 2 and later, I think. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the really interesting stuff is yet to come.
And we're going to be talking about a little bit of that, I take it, on Tuesday, about how this last chapter of part 1 starts to set up the nature of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean,
But I don't want we shouldn't say more.
what we see in part 1 is the building of the John Galt line, including the kind of growing of the circumstances that led her to do it. And we start to see some of what happens in the wake of her building. And I think for the rest of the novel, at least in part 2, there's a lot of thinking about, well, what did that episode mean? And how should we live in light of that? Seems like a note we might end. Are there anyone else who wants to?
We've been going for just over an hour, so it seems to be
Hours is good about to go for a supplemental session. What's it you're making a step? You want to say something, or you want to leave? You guys have.
Many of us have
A lot of us have flights. Yeah. So this is here we are in Atlanta, signing off on an Atlas Project supplemental episode. And
thank you
everyone.
And we're going to see you all on Tuesday again for a discussion of
When we'll be together,
part 1, chapter 0.
You know, every time people clap at the end, I'm never expecting it. Yeah, and I don't know what microphone to go to. But thank you all for clapping.